Worst engineering disasters of all time.
Hey everyone, welcome back to Titanic. I'm your host, Alexa. Today's list is all about things not exactly going to plan. Keep watching to see the absolute worst engineering disasters of all time. Before we get into it, make sure that you're subscribed and ring the bell so that you never miss an upload.
16. Quebec Bridge Collapse, 1907. The saying, build a bridge and get over it, should not have been taken literally by the engineers of the Quebec Bridge, who built a bridge so poorly designed that it collapsed not once, but twice. The project began at the start of the 20th century and was ambitious and one of a kind. The Quebec Bridge was to be the largest cantilever bridge in the world, spanning a length of 1,800 feet. Surprisingly, over a century later, it is still the longest cantilever bridge in the world. The first collapse occurred in 1907 on the 29th of August during construction. 55 people were lost in the incident, all of them working on the construction site. Engineers went back to the drawing board and came back with a solution. They would rebuild the bridge with the lower chords of the cantilever arms stronger than was previously done. On the 11th of September 1916, the bridge crumbled in the central span and 13 more lives were lost. The final total of damage resulted in a $22 million loss. The Quebec Bridge now stands, but its early mistakes made in engineering live on as an example of poor engineering and improper site supervision. 15. Challenger Space Shuttle Explosion, 1986. On the 28th of January 1986, the public's image of space travel changed forever. In one of the most broadcasted space shuttle launches in history, the Challenger Space Shuttle took off, blasting a streak across it behind the sky. The shuttle was a mix of astronauts and ordinary citizens, making it a launch that captured the imaginations of everyone. 73 seconds after takeoff, the rocket, still visible to the naked eye, was swallowed up by a disastrous explosion, and it shocked the world. The President of the United States of America, Ronald Reagan, called for an investigation into the accident and named it the Rogers Commission. It was quickly established that the two rubber O-rings were the cause of the explosion. The most devastating thing about this finding is that for 2 years prior to the explosion, engineers had expressed the opinion openly that they felt these were a cause of weakness in the design of the rocket, and they warned that they could result in the failure of the mission. The whole science behind the failure was so simple that during the Rogers Commission, a member of the team took the stand and demonstrated the O-rings' lack of resilience by placing them in a glass of ice water. They became stiff and couldn't seal the joint properly. The simple experiment blew the NASA safety debate wide open, and it was clear that better points of command were needed to make sure safety concerns were addressed. As a direct result of this disaster and the subsequent hearings, NASA added many checkpoints to their Space Shuttle administration. This included a NASA safety office and a shuttle safety advisory panel so that such glaring mistakes couldn't be overlooked again. 14. The Hindenburg Explosion, 1937.
The German nation has added some incredible engineering achievements to the world, but the Hindenburg is not one of them. The Hindenburg was an airship 3 times the size of a Boeing 747, made of a wooden-framed hot air balloon structure keeping it afloat. The cabin was below the balloon and offered luxury in the sky for its 36 passengers that were served by a further 61 crew members, bringing the total on board to 97.
On the 6th of May 1937, the German LZ-129 Hindenburg was on a commercial flight from Frankfurt, Germany, that had departed 3 days earlier. The Hindenburg's top speed was 84 miles an hour. Nearing its destination of Lakehurst, New Jersey, the airship began attempting to dock. It was at this point that things went horribly wrong. The sky was suddenly filled with fiery smoke, and the burning wooden frame of the Hindenburg ravaged the sky. In less than a minute, the entire airship lay in burning ruins on the ground below. Luckily, 64 people made it out of the disaster alive, but the loss was immense. The images of the flaming airship were broadcast across the world as the first disaster of its nature ever caught on film. It was the end of airship travel forever. A hydrogen gas leak from the fuel cells combined with oxygen and made a lethal combination when a spark was added. The highly flammable mixture turned the Hindenburg into a death trap with no chance of recovery, as the gas on board to make it float was just too vast. 13. The Charles de Gaulle Airport collapse, 2004. In May 2004, the Charles de Gaulle Airport Terminal 2E collapsed. A massive area of the roof was a serious engineering failure, claiming the lives of 4 people on that day and a further 3 who suffered severe injuries. At first, experts struggled to find the reason for the roof collapse, but finally, after thorough checks, it was established that the roof was not designed strong enough to hold the heavy metal pillars it was meant to. The reconstruction efforts cost $120 million, and a far safer airport was reopened in 2008. 12. Tacoma Narrows Bridge Collapse, 1940. When the Tacoma Narrows Bridge was built in 1940, it was the first of many in the world of bridge-building achievements. At the time, it was the first bridge to use plate girders supporting the roadbed. It was the first cable suspension bridge and the 3rd largest suspension bridge. But this combination of design features failed to account for an aeroelastic flutter, so when the wind began to howl down the valley at layover, the bridge would sway and buckle. Not the result you would expect from a bridge that cost $115 million by today's standards. Rightfully so, the engineers began to sweat and began to conduct experiments to study the bridge's structural behavior when exposed to high winds. Although even if they realized the problem, it was too late. Luckily, it helped to ensure no one was injured in the final collapse. On the 7th of November 1940, the wind reached 19 meters per second. That's 43.5 miles an hour, a wind far too strong for the bridge to withstand. The reason for the eventual collapse was the bridge's structural integrity that was critically compromised as a result of built-up torsional vibration amplitude. This causes the 2 ends of the bridge to twist in opposite directions while the center remains motionless. Witnesses could see cracks forming in the bridge when the vibrations reached this fatal frequency. Then the bridge crashed down into the river. The bridge is now an artificial reef, enjoyed by scuba divers. 11. Hyatt Regency Hotel walkway collapse, 1971. When the Hyatt Regency Hotel walkway collapsed, the hotel's lobby was filled with 1,600 people enjoying a tea dance party in Kansas, Missouri. In this tragic moment, poor engineering led to 2 overhead walkways collapsing and killing 114 people and injuring 216 more. It's one of the deadliest engineering disasters in American history. The cause of the horrific accident was a bad decision during construction. The builders noticed a design flaw during the construction and fixed it by making the 2 walkways of 2nd and 4th floors adjacent. This caused double loading on the atrium's roof. The load was equivalent to 64,000 pounds. They used a tie rod in the design that was faulty, and this was a critical error along with the walkway's suspension system from the hotel's atrium roof. 10. The St. Francis Dam failure, 1928.
In the mid-1920s, Los Angeles was in a rate of rapid expansion. To supply the growing city, the St. Francis Dam was built, and American-Irish civil engineer William Mulholland was commissioned to the task.
It was a well-known fact that he designed the dam and was responsible for the entire construction as well. 2 years on, the dam began to leak, and reports of cracks were a warning sign that trouble was brewing. Mulholland refused to accept these reports and ignored the warning signs. In 1928, tragedy struck when the dam burst a mere 2 hours after Mulholland had inspected the structure himself. 450 people, sadly, were lost in this disaster. 9. Titanic sinking, 1912.
The unsinkable ship was a good example of where arrogance gets in the way of good engineering, and the Titanic, as we know, didn't live up to its hype. In 1912, the Titanic was the largest ship ever built, measuring 800 feet and weighing 46,000 tons. We all know the story well. While cruising at its maximum speed of 22 knots, the Titanic hit an iceberg. The collision alone was devastating, and the ship immediately began taking on water. But the engineering failures are what turned the devastating circumstances into the deadly disaster it was.
Firstly, every ocean vessel must have airtight compartments that keep it buoyant. These should be indestructible, but on the Titanic, 5 were completely flooded. These compartments were already smaller than was standard to make room for more space for the first-class public room. Another factor was the high sulfur content in the grade of steel, which doesn't operate well in low temperatures like that of freezing water. This accelerated the sinking when the water weight was added. While disasters do strike, they generally don't turn to tragedies with the right safety equipment available. That was a major problem with the Titanic. The safety gear was severely compromised to make way for more luxuries on the boat. An entire row of safety boats was removed from the original design. This allowed a better view and more space for the first-class occupants. This led to more than half of the 2,200 passengers aboard the Titanic perishing in this tragedy. It only took 3 hours for an iceberg to send the unsinkable ship to the bottom of the ocean. Thankfully, the maritime industry has taken heed of this loss and has modified its safety regulations and taken numerous precautions in ship design to ensure it's never repeated. 8. Chernobyl nuclear explosion, 1986. When the Chernobyl nuclear power station exploded on the 26th of April 1986 in Pripyat, Ukraine, no one would have guessed that this would be the costliest disaster in history, and that only later the real fatalities could be counted. The explosion resulted in the loss of 62 people, but the long-term effect of radiation-related illness is estimated to be as high as 9,000 victims. The nuclear power is highly toxic and contaminates any area where it's mishandled, like in the case of the nuclear explosion. The results are radiation sickness and radioactive cancer. This is why the engineering surrounding nuclear power needs to be so carefully controlled, and that is exactly what nuclear technicians failed to do. During a poorly planned experiment, the technicians at the reactor Unit 4 switched off the reactor's power regulating system and its emergency safety systems. Then, too many control rods were removed from the core by workers, and the reactor was allowed to run. That night, the core's chain reaction became uncontrolled and triggered a series of explosions. Flames flew out of the graphite reactor core, and a mass of radioactive material spewed into the atmosphere. Only the following day were the 30,000 Pripyat residents evacuated, but the damage from exposure to the radiation was already done. Lessons were learned, but unfortunately, too late for many. 7. The steamboat explosion in the SS Sultana, 1865. The SS Sultana was a steamboat frequenting the rivers of Mississippi and Ohio, built in the city of Cincinnati as a steamboat that boasted the most highly advanced safety equipment of the time. In 1865, a completely overcrowded SS Sultana set sail with 2,300 passengers on board. The passengers included the crew, civilians, and prisoners of war. A few miles from Memphis, the Sultana exploded and sank, taking down 1,500 to 1,800 passengers with her. While the explosion was caused by 3 out of the 4 boilers exploding, the engineering inspection and reporting chain are what had failed. The leakage which led to the boilers exploding was reported days before, and the repair done was substandard. The overloading was another bad decision that led to the gravity of the disaster being as much as it was. 6. Banqiao Dam failure, 1975. Banqiao Dam in China was known as the Iron Dam, an unbreakable engineering wonder. But in 1975, its reign came to an end when the dam wall crumbled, flooding everything in its path and claiming 230,000 lives. A further 11 million people were forced to relocate because of the damage. The economic loss was estimated to be $1.5 billion for China. The toppling was due to poor design, lack of maintenance, and unsafe construction. 5. The Fukushima Daiichi nuclear disaster, 2011. Since Chernobyl, there had not been another nuclear event in the world, but in 2011, that streak was ended with the cataclysmic Fukushima reactor disaster. When the Tohoku earthquake struck, it sent a tsunami hurtling towards Fukushima. The earthquake itself caused the nuclear plant's fission reaction to shut down. Bad design led to an electricity supply fail, meaning the reactor's cores failed to receive any coolant. At this stage, the tsunami reached the seawall of the plant and crashed right over the 14-meter height. The water destroyed the emergency generators, so there was a complete nuclear meltdown. 3 hydrogen explosions caused a massive release of radioactive contamination. A 20-kilometer radius was evacuated, and a larger area of people were moved to lower radiation areas too. Large quantities of contaminated water were released into the ocean, but since then, a wall has been created to prevent the leakage. There were devastating consequences to the environment, and the cleanup is estimated to take between 30 and 40 years. After a great investigation, it was clear that adequate safety requirements were not fulfilled. Later in 2012, the operator, Tokyo Electric Power Company, finally admitted having failed to take the necessary measures to prevent such a disaster. 4. The Rana Plaza collapse. 2013 saw our screens dominated with a tragedy unfolding in front of our eyes as one of the worst industrial disasters took place in Dhaka, Bangladesh. At least 2,500 people were injured and 1,100 casualties. The building was the Rana Plaza, a 5-story commercial building that housed a bank, factories, some apartments, and shops. The site collapsed unexpectedly, leaving only the ground floor intact. The biggest flaw was the building was built on a filled-in pond, which would obviously compromise the structural integrity of the building. The building was 3 floors taller than the original permit allowed, and the construction material way below standard. The site owners compensated the victims' families to the value of $40 million. 3. Britain Rail Disaster, 1915. A special troops train, a local train, and the night express coming north from Euston Station collided at the junction due to a signalman's failure. They had been rushed to do some paperwork and simply forgot about the local train. They gave the all clear for the troop train, which ran straight into the local train. A few minutes later, the express train traveling north collided into the wreckage, and it all caught on fire. 3 officers, 29 non-commissioned officers, and 182 soldiers were killed in the disaster. 2. The Vasa sinking, 1628. Sweden planned to impress the world with its new ship, the Vasa, built in 1626. It had 64 cannons, was 226 feet long, and boasted that it could fire 650 pounds of ammunition from one side. But the maiden voyage was a disaster of epic proportions when the top-heavy ship encountered wind, and only 1 nautical mile from the port, it sank. The wind toppled the ship onto its side, water flooded through the gun portals, and the ship sank into the shallow waters of the Stockholm harbor just 32 meters below the surface. The ship is on display at the Vasa Museum in Stockholm, Sweden. 1. The Pennsylvanian Johnstown Flood, 1889. The South Fork Dam is an example of how one mistake can cost you an entire town. Johnstown was a prosperous steel production town in Pennsylvania, but heavy rains and neglect of a dam resulted in the dam crumbling. The flood from the dam wiped out thousands of lives and was known as the Great Flood of 1889. The dam was quite poorly maintained, and under the pressure from Lake Conemaugh, the wall came down. By 1889 standards, the loss of property was near $17 million, but the cost to lives was far greater.